If you've ever felt like you were living someone else's dream instead of your own, or wondered what might happen if you finally walked away from a path chosen for you, then you'll recognize something of yourself in this story. My name is Ethan Cole, and for as long as I can remember, my life was supposed to follow a script, one written by tradition, expectation, and the unspoken weight of family legacy. Some families pass down recipes or heirlooms. Mine passed down an empire. My earliest memories were not of playgrounds, but of boardrooms, of watching my father, Richard Cole, command respect with a word, of seeing my older sister Victoria and younger brother Brandon rehearsing their roles at the table as if the future was already set in stone. I was the golden son, the one who would take the reins someday, the one who everyone thought could never possibly fail. But life has a way of testing what you think you know about yourself. It was at a dinner, much like any other polished silver expensive wine, the low hum of polite conversation, when everything changed. A single accusation, a moment of doubt, and suddenly, everything I had been building toward vanished like smoke. That was the night I realized, sometimes you have to lose your place in the family story to discover the truth about who you really are. In the next hour, I'm going to take you on a journey, not just through my rise and fall, but through all the invisible moments in between. I'll share the lessons I learned mopping floors, the friends I found in places no one ever thought to look, and the mistakes that taught me more than any degree or business seminar ever could. We'll talk about pride, forgiveness, and the surprising strength you find when everyone else counts you out. You'll see what it means to build something real from the ground up, and to measure success by the lives you touch, not just the assets you own. But before we begin, I want you to think about your own story. Have you ever been underestimated by your family, by your colleagues, maybe even by yourself? Have you ever wished you could start over and wondered if it was too late? If so, you're not alone. This is a story for anyone who's ever had to rebuild, who's ever carried the sting of disappointment or the weight of second chances. So settle in with me. Let's pull back the curtain on what it really means to succeed, not in the eyes of others, but on your own terms. Because sometimes the greatest journeys begin when you finally step off the path everyone else has mapped out for you. And as you'll see, every empire starts with a single brick laid by hands that refused to give up, even when no one was watching. For most of my life, the future felt predetermined, like a movie I'd watched 100 times before. I grew up in the echo of my family's expectations, surrounded by stories of how the Cole legacy began with nothing and became a real estate empire. There were photos on every wall, my father breaking ground on his first building, my mother cutting ribbons at community centers, my siblings at galas and fundraisers. My own childhood memories are filled with the scent of ink and old leather afternoons spent in my father's office, learning to read balance sheets long before I was ever trusted to ride my bike alone. In the Cole household, good enough wasn't a compliment, it was the starting line. Excellence was the only thing that counted, and even then, it was never quite enough. Yet, even as I tried to fit myself into the golden boy mold, there was always a part of me that felt strangely out of step. I remember one Thanksgiving, I was 15, sitting between my father and my sister Victoria, the two of them discussing expansion plans for a downtown tower as if it was the most natural thing in the world. My brother Brandon chimed in with ideas he'd picked up from the evening news. I nodded along, but my mind kept drifting to the kitchen, where our longtime cook, Mrs. Green, was humming quietly as she basted the turkey. I remember wondering if she'd ever dreamed of something different, if she'd ever wanted more than what people expected from her. That same restlessness gnawed at me for years, a silent question I never quite dared to ask aloud. Still, the pressure to perform was always stronger than the doubts. By 25, I had an MBA, a corner office at Cole & Partners, and a calendar filled with meetings that were supposed to shape the city's skyline. On paper, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. But I felt like a ghost at my own banquet, showing up every day to play a part written long before I was born. I could recite the family creed in my sleep, but I didn't know what I actually believed. The truth is that many of us find ourselves living by scripts we didn't write, chasing approval we may never fully receive. In America, we love the idea of the self-made man, but we rarely talk about the burden of inherited dreams. The turning point came one rainy night in October during a board meeting that changed everything. The air was thick with tension. My father's jaw was set, his eyes cold as marble. There'd been a deal gone wrong, millions lost, and the finger was pointed, at least in part, toward me. The details hardly matter now, but what I remember most was the silence that followed my explanation. It wasn't anger or disappointment that hurt most. It was the quiet confirmation in their eyes that I had become, in that moment, the family's first real failure. The golden sun had fallen. By the next morning, my desk was empty, my nameplate gone. I didn't quit, but I didn't fight to stay either. Sometimes losing your place in a story is the only way to find your way out. At first, leaving felt like stepping off a cliff. My friends, most of them from the same circles, looked at me with polite confusion. My mother called every day, her voice threaded with worry and hope that I'd come to my senses. My father's silence said more than words ever could. People talk about freedom as if it's this glorious, sparkling thing, but what they don't tell you is how lonely it can feel at the start. The world outside the family bubble was unfamiliar, sharp-edged, sometimes even cruel. I took a job at a property management company on the other side of town, far from skyscrapers and gala dinners, working maintenance on apartment buildings where no one cared about my last name. My first paycheck was barely enough to cover rent, but for the first time I felt something like relief. I was a nobody and I had space to breathe. There's a funny thing that happens when you strip away your old identity. The world doesn't end and slowly you begin to see things differently. I learned more in those first few months of scraping floors, fixing leaky faucets, and hauling trash than I ever did in a boardroom. The residents in those buildings didn't care who I was. They cared if I showed up on time, if I listened when something broke, if I treated them with respect. I'll never forget Mrs. Jennings in apartment 3C, an elderly widow who left cookies outside her door every Tuesday just to thank the maintenance boys. Or Ramon, my supervisor, who took pride in teaching me how to unclog a drain with nothing but a bent wire hanger and some patience. These weren't lessons in real estate. They were lessons in humility and humanity. Looking back, I realized the real turning point wasn't the night I left the company. It was the moment I understood that worth isn't measured by titles or family names, but by the way you show up for the people around you. In a city obsessed with big deals and bigger egos, I learned to find meaning in the smallest acts, a door fixed, a smile shared, a promise kept. The Golden Sun narrative was never mine to begin with. Stepping away from it didn't make me a failure. It made me free to write my own story. If there's a lesson in this part of the journey, it's this. Walking away from someone else's idea of success is never easy, but it might be the bravest thing you ever do. We all have moments when we have to choose stay where it's safe or step into the unknown, trusting that something better might be waiting. For me, that choice was just the beginning. Because as it turned out, every skill I needed to build something real would come from the world I once looked down on. And as I swept the last crumbs from a stairwell late one night, a new question settled in my mind. Not, how far have I fallen, but how high could I climb if I started from the very bottom? Little did I know that answer was closer than I ever imagined. Trading the crisp suits and high-rise views of my old life for a pair of work boots and a battered toolbox was a shock to my system. I had spent years mastering financial projections and negotiating contracts worth millions, but nothing prepared me for the humility of mopping hallways at 6 a.m. The rhythm of my days was set by the buzz of fluorescent lights and the faint smell of disinfectant. At first, I was certain everyone around me could see right through my clumsy attempts to fit in a suit, pretending to be a laborer. But as the weeks passed, I learned there is no shortcut to earning trust. In this world, no one cared about my degree. What mattered was whether I carried my weight and didn't look down on anyone. My first real friend in this new chapter was Joe Martinez, the senior maintenance man who had worked in the building since the year I was born. Joe had calloused hands, a gravelly laugh, and a habit of telling stories while we worked stories about his childhood in Texas, his dreams and the heartbreaks that shaped him. I remember the first time I broke a water main by accident, flooding half the basement. Joe didn't yell or shake his head. He just handed me a mop and said, "Everybody makes a mess at the start, Ethan. The good ones stick around to clean it up." That day, something clicked for me. Respect wasn't given here, it was earned little by little, with each job done right and each mistake owned. As I moved from one job to another, sometimes cleaning graffiti, other times patching drywall, I realized the work itself was never beneath me. The real challenge was in learning how to ask for help and admit when I didn't know something. In the corporate world, I had been trained to have all the answers to hide any hint of uncertainty. Here, vulnerability was the price of entry. I started watching Joe, closely picking up on the tricks of the trade, how he listened to tenants with patience, how he could diagnose a boiler's problem by the sound it made, how he greeted every member of the staff by name. It was a lesson in leadership unlike anything I had seen in a boardroom. Leadership, I discovered, had less to do with authority and more to do with service. One morning, we got a call about a leaking ceiling in a low-income unit. The tenant, Ms. Harper, was a single mother of three working double shifts at a diner. When we arrived, she was frantic, apologizing for the mess and worrying about the cost of repairs. Joe put her at ease, immediately promising we'd do whatever it took to fix the problem. I spent most of that afternoon wedged in a crawl space, my shirt covered in dust, and insulation sweating and sore. As we finished, Joe turned to me and said quietly, "Don't ever forget what it feels like to work for something that really matters to someone." That day, I saw the difference a small act of kindness could make, and how the people most overlooked are often the ones carrying the heaviest burdens. Slowly, my relationships with the maintenance crew deepened. We shared lunches in the boiler room, traded stories about our families, and offered advice on everything from stubborn pipes to stubborn bosses. For the first time in my life, I belonged to a team that valued honesty over appearances, effort over pedigree. These friendships became my anchor, reminding me that real connection doesn't depend on what you have, but who you are. I learned to appreciate the quiet pride in a job well done, the satisfaction of a light switched on a faucet that finally stopped dripping, the gratitude in a tenant's smile. Looking back, I understand now how much I gained in those early years. The world measures success in titles and dollars, but I started to measure mine in lessons learned: how to listen without judging, how to apologize without ego, how to show up for people who expected nothing but your best. Every blister and bruise became a badge of honor. I stopped hiding from my past and started using what I'd learned: budgeting skills, people management, even a little Spanish, to make myself useful in ways that mattered. The walls that separated us and them in my old life began to crumble, replaced by respect, built on real experience. If there's a lesson in these early days, it's that humility is the true foundation of growth. It's tempting to chase the approval of those above you, but some of the richest wisdom comes from those the world overlooks. When you open yourself to learning from everyone, no matter their title, background, or pay grade, you discover that expertise is everywhere waiting to be shared. I realized that what I once saw as a step down was in fact a step forward. And as weeks became months, my perspective shifted again. I found myself dreaming not just of personal redemption, but of building something better: a workplace, a team, maybe even a company, where the value of every person was recognized. But before I could build anything new, I would have to learn 1,000 small lessons from the ground up. And in the heart of every lesson was a story of failure, of effort, of respect. Those stories became my roadmap for what would come next. Little did I know one unexpected crisis would soon test everything I'd learned and show me just how much I still had to grow. The days soon blurred together into a pattern of routine and surprise. There was something humbling, almost meditative, about starting each morning before dawn, sweeping the sidewalks in front of old brick apartment buildings, while the city was still half asleep. I found a rhythm in the work: the scrape of the broom, the clank of the mop bucket, the simple satisfaction of seeing something dirty turn clean beneath my hands. But life, as I'd begun to learn, rarely lets you coast for long without tossing you into deeper water. One Thursday afternoon, the elevator in our oldest building stopped working. To most of the residents, it was a mere inconvenience. But for Mrs. Feldman on the 5th floor, a woman in her late 80s with a walker and a stubborn sense of independence, it was a disaster. When I arrived, she was sitting at the bottom of the stairs, groceries scattered, eyes shining with unshed tears. "I just wanted to make it to bingo," she whispered, voice trembling. In that moment, the job became more than just repairs or maintenance. It was about dignity, community, and meeting people where they are. I'll never forget the hours that followed. Joe and I tore through the service manuals, sweating side by side in a windowless control room, wires and diagrams splayed out like a puzzle with no clear answer. For the first time, I wasn't the smartest person in the room. I made mistakes, flipped the wrong circuit, dropped a screwdriver into the shaft, lost my patience more than once. Each time, Joe would simply say, "Slow down, Ethan. If you rush the job, you'll just make a bigger mess." I learned minute by minute that skill wasn't just about technical know-how. It was about attention, patience, and the willingness to ask for help. Eventually, we got the elevator running, though, not without a few creative solutions that would have made my old engineering professors raise an eyebrow. As we finished, Mrs. Feldman offered us both cookies and a grateful, weary smile. "You boys saved my day," she said, pressing a wrinkled hand over mine. That small moment, helping someone regain a bit of independence, meant more than any deal I'd ever closed in a boardroom. I realized that success could be measured in ways I'd never considered before. Mistakes, I found, were my greatest teachers. Like the time I thought I could patch a leaky pipe with tape, and optimism, only to flood the entire laundry room and ruin a tenant's favorite sneakers. Or when I tried to fix a broken light fixture in the lobby and ended up short-circuiting the power to 3 apartments. Each error was met not with ridicule, but with gentle corrections, sometimes from Joe, sometimes from Ramon, sometimes from the tenants themselves. They'd seen plenty of smart guys come and go, but they could spot a learner from a mile away. What mattered was owning my mistakes and making it right every single time. There was another lesson too: no one is ever truly self-sufficient. I grew up thinking strength meant knowing everything and never asking for help. But down in the boiler rooms, strength meant knowing when you needed backup. I saw how the best teams were built, not around perfect individuals, but around trust. Joe would cover my shift so I could rest after a tough day. I'd stay late to help Ramon prepare for an inspection. In small ways, we took care of each other. The camaraderie that grew from shared struggles was the glue that held us together. One rainy evening, as we gathered in the cramped maintenance office to share takeout, Joe shared a story about his own early days. He'd once nearly set a building sprinkler system off by accident, and it took a team effort and a lot of mopping to make it right. "You learn from the people around you, Ethan," he said. "Doesn't matter what your diploma says. Everybody has a lesson to teach if you're willing to listen." It struck me how much I'd overlooked before, how much quiet wisdom exists in places that never get spotlighted. The deeper I got into the daily life of the building, the more I saw the layers that made it run. From the cleaning crew who knew which tenants needed extra help to the delivery guy who always left a little extra for the elderly on his route to the night security guard who made sure no one felt alone after dark. These were the silent stewards of the city, the people whose efforts kept everything ticking, often without a word of thanks. By learning from them, I slowly let go of the pride that had kept me at arm's length. If there's a lesson to be found here, it's that real growth starts when you stop pretending you have all the answers. The world rewards those who learn to listen, who admit when they're wrong, who show up even when it's uncomfortable. In the end, every floor I mopped, every fuse I replaced, every apology I made became a step forward, not just in my job, but in the kind of person I was becoming. The humility I gained in the boiler rooms and stairwells would shape the foundation for everything that came after. So often we rush to the top without learning what holds the building up from below. The truth is, every act of service, no matter how small, teaches us something that can't be learned in classrooms or corner offices. In those early years, I thought I was just working a job. But in reality, I was building a foundation for a new kind of life, one grounded in respect, humility, and genuine connection. And little did I know those lessons would soon be put to the test in ways I never could have predicted. For one day, a crisis would hit, not just a broken elevator or a leaky pipe, but a challenge that would force me to draw on every lesson I'd learned and lead a team that had become more like family than colleagues. That was the day I discovered what I was truly made of. It's funny how the moments that matter most rarely look dramatic in the beginning. The day that changed my standing with the crew and taught me what trust really meant started with nothing more than a quiet rumor and a leaking ceiling on the top floor of one of our oldest buildings. We'd had a stretch of heavy rain, and by mid-morning water was seeping through the plaster in apartment 7B, trickling down the hallway walls and pooling at the foot of the stairs. It was the sort of headache that used to be someone else's problem. Now it was mine. I arrived on site with my toolkit, my mind spinning with possible solutions. Joe was out sick that day, so the responsibility landed on me. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, water squishing beneath my boots. When I reached 7B, Mrs. Walker, an elderly widow who prided herself on her independence, met me at the door clutching a faded dish towel and a worried frown. "It's spreading," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. The building was old, the pipes ancient, and the whole situation had the potential to get out of hand quickly. I took a deep breath, knelt down, and began to assess the damage, determined not to let my anxiety show. What I didn't realize was that the rest of the maintenance crew had been watching. In the world I'd come from, performance was measured in reports and revenue charts. Here it was measured in sweat and reliability. By noon, the crisis had grown. Several more apartments reported leaks, and rumors of mold were starting to circulate among the tenants. Ramon, who'd never quite trusted me before, showed up to help without a word. Soon others joined in, each person bringing what tools or knowledge they could offer. We became a team out of necessity, not design, with everyone working side by side and sopping clothes and aching backs. I can still remember the shift in energy that happened over the next few hours. There was no time for ego or second guessing. We simply moved from problem to problem, sharing advice and dividing tasks. I took Ramon's suggestions seriously, even when they contradicted my instincts. I listened to Maria from the cleaning staff when she pointed out which apartments had children with allergies and needed extra attention. Instead of issuing orders, I found myself asking for help, and for the first time, people answered. Trust wasn't built with grand gestures, but through 100 small moments, holding a ladder steady, passing the right wrench, sharing a sandwich during a break. By dusk, we had patched the leaks, dried the carpets, and reassured every resident that things would be okay. As I packed up my tools, Mrs. Walker pressed a trembling hand into mine. "Thank you," she said softly, "not just for fixing the leak, but for staying until it was done." Her words lingered with me long after I left, echoing in the quiet as I walked home. In that simple moment, I understood what Joe had always tried to teach people. Remember how you make them feel, not just what you accomplish. That evening, the crew gathered in the basement for pizza, a tradition after big repairs. The mood was different. Ramon clapped me on the shoulder, Maria shared stories from her childhood, and even the building supervisor, who'd been skeptical of me from the start, offered a rare smile. We laughed about the chaos, teased each other about our muddy clothes, and celebrated the fact that we'd gotten through the day together. For the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider playing a part. I was part of something bigger than myself. The camaraderie that grew from that day was real, earned through effort and trust. Looking back, I realize now how critical those bonds were. In a world where every person is fighting their own battles, teamwork becomes the safety net that catches you when you fall. I learned to value every member of our crew, not just for their skills, but for their stories, their resilience, and the unique way each contributed to the whole. There's an old saying, "Wanna go fast, go alone. Wanna go far, go together." I used to think success was a solo journey. Now I knew better. The lesson from those long, wet hours was simple, but profound. Trust is not given. It's built brick by brick through honest effort and shared struggle. Real leadership isn't about commanding from above, it's about showing up side by side, especially when things get messy. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. In the boardrooms of my old life, I'd never understood that fully. In the boiler rooms and stairwells, I finally did. Over the months that followed, our team became my anchor, and the building itself felt like a living thing. Its people, its quirks, its silent strengths. The friendships I forged during those early crises would become the foundation of everything I was about to build. But just as I found my footing, life threw me my first big opportunity and my first big test. There's a saying in real estate. Every building tells a story. Mine was only just beginning. Because soon I'd be asked to step up not just as a worker or a teammate, but as a leader. And as I'd soon learn, every brick of trust I'd built was about to be tested in ways I never imagined. The weeks that followed the leak crisis felt like a turning point, not just for my relationships, but for the way I saw my own future. I found myself waking up before dawn with something like excitement, eager to meet the new day's challenges, no matter how small or gritty. With trust now running through the team, the job didn't feel lonely or menial. Instead, each task, no matter how humble, became another piece in a growing sense of purpose. Yet the world has a way of keeping us humble, and I was about to learn that progress rarely happens in a straight line. It started with an opportunity that landed on my lap almost by accident. The landlord of the building where we worked, an older man named Mr. Conway, who spent most mornings sipping coffee in the lobby, approached me after hearing from tenants about how our crew had handled the flooding. He was impressed by the sense of community and care, and he wondered if I might help with another building he owned across town. The place was run down and half vacant, with broken windows and a reputation for trouble. I didn't hesitate. I saw a chance to apply what I'd learned, and maybe take the first step towards something bigger. I enlisted Joe and Ramon to help on weekends. We patched walls, fixed plumbing, and painted over the scars of years of neglect. But the real work was in talking to the residents, listening to their worries, building trust, showing them someone cared. Some nights I'd stay late just to share a cup of coffee with Mrs. Lee on the third floor, who'd lost her husband the year before and worried constantly about moving out. Other times I'd join the kids in sweeping the sidewalk, turning a chore into a game. Slowly the building changed, not just in appearance, but in spirit. People started greeting each other in the halls. Vacant units filled. Even the most skeptical tenants pitched in to help. With Conway's blessing, I proposed a simple investment plan. A handful of us, mostly workers, a few tenants and myself, would pool our savings to buy a small stake in the building. It wasn't a lot, but it meant that everyone had a reason to care. I put in every penny I had saved, and Joe, hesitant at first, invested what he could. The first time our tiny group received a dividend, it felt like striking gold. For many, it was the first time they'd ever owned a piece of anything. For me, it was a lesson in the power of shared ownership and collective effort, a real win built from the ground up. But nothing worthwhile comes without its setbacks. Emboldened by our early success, I started to believe I had things figured out. When another property came up for sale, a tired duplex in a struggling neighborhood, I rushed in, barely glancing at the fine print. I convinced a few friends from the crew to join me, eager to recreate our earlier victory. This time, things went wrong from the start. The place had hidden problems, outdated, wiring, a leaking roof, and a mountain of unpaid back taxes. My confidence quickly turned to panic as repair costs soared and city inspectors flagged issue after issue. The worst moment came when I realized I'd risked not just my own money, but Joe's too. For weeks, I barely slept, sick with guilt over letting down the people who had believed in me. Joe, ever the steady hand, didn't blame me. Instead, he reminded me of something I'd once told him. Every job teaches you something, even the ugly ones. He rolled up his sleeves and went to work, helping me untangle the mess deal by mistake. Together, we negotiated with City Hall, found contractors willing to work for less, and bit by bit saved what we could. We didn't come out ahead, but we didn't lose everything either. Most importantly, I learned the value of humility, due diligence, and the courage to ask for help when I was in over my head. The lesson that stuck with me was simple. Early wins can breed overconfidence, and success is never guaranteed. I learned to see failure not as the end, but as a teacher, sometimes harsher than we'd like, but always honest. I became careful, yes, but not cynical. With every setback, I grew a little more patient, a little more aware of the hidden risks that can trip you up when you least expect it. I learned to celebrate progress in small increments and to recognize that real growth happens when you pick yourself up after a fall. By the time we'd finally stabilized the duplex, I was a different person, quieter, more thoughtful, but also more determined than ever. I doubled down on building relationships, not just with my team, but with tenants, vendors, and even city officials. I started keeping a small notebook, jotting down lessons learned from every deal, every mistake, every conversation. I'd sit with Joe over coffee in the mornings, dissecting what went wrong and how we'd do better next time. In those quiet moments, I realized how much I'd gained, not in wealth, but in wisdom and grit. If there's a lesson here, it's this: first wins are sweet, but first losses are what shape you. They teach you to respect the journey, to cherish the people who stand by you, and to find value in perseverance rather than perfection. I no longer chased shortcuts or easy victories. Instead, I focused on building brick by brick, person by person, lesson by lesson. And as our team grew stronger, so did my dream. I began to imagine something beyond a single building, a network of places where respect, dignity, and shared purpose could thrive. I didn't know it then, but every scar from those early losses would become the foundation for something far bigger and much more meaningful than I'd ever dared hope for. The quiet rise of our invisible empire was about to begin. The season changed, but the work never really slowed. What began as a small experiment, a group of maintenance workers and tenants pooling their modest savings to buy into a single building, sparked something deeper in me. I started looking at the city differently, not as a cluster of anonymous towers, but as a patchwork of stories, dreams, and second chances. I realized that the same quiet determination that got us through leaky ceilings and city inspectors could build something bigger if we just kept showing up. I began seeking out properties that others overlooked. These were the buildings no one wanted: weathered facades, peeling paint, half-empty halls echoing with more memories than hope. Where some saw liabilities, I saw possibility. I'd walk the block at dusk, notebook in hand, taking stock of every broken window and burned-out light. It was hard work and often thankless, but I felt a sense of quiet ownership in every handshake and hallway conversation. My old fear of failing faded, replaced by a steady belief in progress, slow, sometimes invisible, but real. Over time, I grew better at spotting opportunity. I learned how to negotiate with reluctant sellers, how to spot signs of good bones beneath years of neglect, and how to build a small but loyal group of investors, willing to trust my vision. Most of all, I learned to listen to the elderly woman who just wanted a safe place to walk her dog, to the young family who hoped for better schools, to the janitor with a cousin who knew how to fix elevators. By paying attention to what people actually needed, I found ways to improve buildings from the inside out and to make even the oldest structures feel new again. Our team evolved too. Joe became not just a mentor, but my right hand. Ramon took over operations at one of our newest buildings, proving that leadership isn't about titles, but about earning trust. Maria, who started as a cleaner, began managing tenant relations, her gentle presence calming disputes before they ever grew. We paid fair wages, gave everyone a stake in our success, and built a culture where ideas could come from anywhere. I realized then that building a company was less about buying property and more about growing people. Some nights I'd walk the empty corridors of a newly acquired building, listening to the echoes of old lives. Sometimes I'd find a child's forgotten toy, or a letter tucked behind a radiator, a reminder that these places had always been more than numbers on a spreadsheet. On one occasion, while helping a tenant move in, I met Mrs. Alvarez, a retired schoolteacher with a passion for gardening. She had transformed a neglected courtyard into a miniature oasis, planting sunflowers along the fence and sharing fresh herbs with her neighbors. She reminded me that community is built on the smallest acts of care. The world rarely noticed our work. There were no front-page articles, no TV crews filming ribbon cuttings. We operated quietly, using holding companies to protect our anonymity and let the results speak for themselves. By the time our little group had purchased its fifth building, I realized we'd created a kind of invisible empire, one where every person felt seen, every improvement mattered, and every story was worth hearing. Our reputation spread not through advertisements, but through word of mouth, a tenant telling a friend, a worker recommending us to a neighbor. One challenge, though, was holding to our values as we grew. It's easy to make promises when you're small. It's harder to keep them when new investors ask tough questions, or when a lucrative offer tempts you to sell out. There were times I struggled with doubt, afraid we'd lose what made us special. But every time Joe or Maria would pull me aside and remind me of our core principle, respect comes first. Always. When a major investor pressured me to evict a family over late rent, I met with the tenants, personally learned their story, and helped them get back on track. No headlines, just quiet dignity. If there's a lesson to this stage of the journey, it's that real success grows slowly and quietly. You don't have to shout to make an impact. The most meaningful changes are often the ones no one else sees. A light left on for a late shift worker, a playground fixed up before summer, a staff meeting where every voice is heard. I learned to cherish progress measured not in square footage, but in trust, safety, and a sense of belonging. Looking back, the buildings were just the backdrop for something much more important. We were building a culture, a new kind of company that treated janitors and managers with equal respect, that saw every challenge as a lesson, every person as a potential partner. The invisible empire we built didn't come with a crown, but with a sense of quiet pride that comes from making things better day by day. But every story has a turning point, and ours was coming fast. As our success quietly grew, words started to leak out first as whispers among competitors, then as uncomfortable questions from my own family. The empire we'd built in the shadows was about to be pulled into the light. I didn't know it then, but my journey was about to collide with the world I'd left behind, the family, the business, the expectations I thought I'd escaped for good. And as the city woke up to what we'd achieved, I would have to decide what mattered more, keeping the peace or standing firm in the values that got us here. It's strange how after years of going unnoticed, a single rumor can turn everything upside down. At first, the changes came quietly, a few phone calls from former colleagues, awkward invitations to industry lunches I hadn't attended in years, questions from local brokers about a string of surprising property sales. I tried to keep my distance, focusing on the work that mattered most. But when your last name is Cole, secrets don't stay hidden for long. I still remember the day my family finally put the pieces together. It started with a city news story about a rundown building in Midtown, once notorious for its high crime and poor conditions, now transformed into a bright, thriving space for families. The article mentioned the anonymous ownership group, their investments in affordable housing, and the remarkable turnaround driven by a quietly effective team. There was no mention of me by name, but my brother Brandon always sharp connected the dots. Within hours, my phone buzzed with a terse message from my father. Family meeting. Tomorrow, noon. Don't be late. Walking into that boardroom was like stepping into a museum of my past. My father sat at the head of the table, stern and controlled, while my sister Victoria watched from behind her lawyer's glasses, arms folded. Brandon glanced up from his phone, curiosity and accusation blending in his eyes. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of all the years I'd spent trying to live up to their standards and then deliberately slipping away. The first question was simple, but loaded. How did you do it? My father's voice was low, more baffled than angry. I told them the truth, how I'd started with nothing but sweat, a few friends, and a handful of rundown buildings no one else wanted. How we'd built trust, one broken pipe and leaky roof at a time. How we made every tenant a partner, every worker a stakeholder. Victoria cut in her words sharp. You could have come home. You could have brought this to the family firm. I shook my head, remembering all the ways I'd tried years before to bring new ideas into a place that only valued tradition and control. Brandon, ever the pragmatist, asked about the business itself. How did we finance these deals? Why stay anonymous? What was the end game? I explained our quiet approach, holding companies shared, equity reinvesting every profit. It wasn't about headlines, I said. It was about dignity, ours and theirs. Their disbelief was almost comical. For so long, I'd been the family's cautionary tale. Now I was the puzzle they couldn't quite solve. My father's next move was predictable. He offered partnership, a merger, a chance to combine our strengths. He spoke of legacy, of restoring the Cole name to its rightful place at the forefront of the city's development. But I could see in his eyes that old hunger for control, the same one that had driven me away in the first place. For a moment I wavered. The idea of being accepted, of finally proving myself, still tugged at something deep inside. But then I remembered Joe Maria and all the others who had risked everything on my vision. I realized that what we had built was too precious to compromise. I declined the offer. What we're doing isn't just business, I said softly. It's about changing how people are treated, how success is shared. I can't give that up, not for any price. The silence that followed was both tense and liberating. My family didn't understand, not really, but for the first time I didn't need them to. I left that meeting lighter, sure of my path. I'd found something more valuable than approval: integrity. Later, as I walked back to my office, I thought about the road ahead. With the truth out, competitors and critics would soon come knocking. There would be rumors, maybe even attempts to undermine what we'd built. But I felt ready. The years of learning from the ground up had given me more than just business acumen, they had given me resilience. If there's a lesson here, it's that success built quietly and honestly will eventually speak for itself. You can't hide genuine impact forever. Sooner or later, the world takes notice. But the real test comes when you're asked to trade your values for validation. I learned that day that real power is having the courage to say no, even when it's tempting to seek acceptance from those who once doubted you. As I returned to my team, I shared what had happened and thanked them for believing in our way. They understood the stakes, knew that our mission was more important than making headlines. We celebrated with pizza in the maintenance office, laughing at the absurdity of it all. I realized that in the eyes of my crew, I was already enough, not because of my family name, but because of what we had built together. But I also knew that brighter lights attract longer shadows. With our work now in the public eye, the next challenge would not come from within my family, but from those who stood to lose the most as we redefined the rules of the game. As the city buzzed with questions about who we were and what we stood for, I prepared for the storm to come, one that would test the strength of our invisible empire and the bonds of trust we had so carefully built. The days after my family learned the truth brought an energy that felt both exhilarating and precarious. Our quiet rise was now a topic of conversation at City Hall real estate conventions, and most troubling among some of the city's most established property moguls. What we had built they saw as a threat. Not only did our approach challenge the status quo, but it made their ways look cold and outdated by comparison. I quickly realized that success when it comes quietly is often envied the most. The first challenge came as rumors. An anonymous blog began questioning our financing. How could a nobody like me, a maintenance worker, buy up half a dozen buildings in just a few years? Some speculated about hidden investors. Others hinted at something shadier. For a while, it was almost amusing. Then came the letters, city inspectors suddenly arriving for surprise checks, audits from agencies that had ignored our neighborhoods for years, even a visit from a lawyer representing an unnamed concerned citizens group. It was clear someone wanted to rattle us, to force mistakes or shake loose secrets that could bring our progress to a halt. I called a meeting in the basement of our oldest building. Around the table were Joe Maria, Ramon, and a handful of the team who had been with me since the beginning. Instead of panic, there was a steady resolve. "We've built this the right way," Joe reminded everyone. "Let them dig, they'll only find hard work and honest deals." Still, we had to be careful. I spent late nights reviewing records, preparing documents, double-checking every contract. We brought in a lawyer, someone who once rented from us and knew what it meant to be overlooked and underestimated. Their advice was simple transparency, humility, and patience. Real trouble came when one of our competitors tried to poach our staff with promises of higher pay and easier hours. A few people left, and for a moment I worried our spirit would crumble. But instead, something else happened. Maria began holding informal coffee hours, listening to worries, sharing our company's mission, and reminding everyone why we'd chosen this path. We didn't match the offers, but we did something better. We promoted from within, gave more people a share in our successes, and celebrated every team member's contribution. It wasn't about holding on out of fear. It was about choosing to belong. I learned firsthand that resilience isn't about never being shaken. It's about knowing who you are when you're tested. One afternoon, I received a call from Mrs. Alvarez, the retired teacher, who'd tended our community garden. She'd heard neighbors whispering about our business being in trouble. "Don't let them change you, Ethan," she said. "We need people who remember what it's like to be on our side." That single call centered me more than any business meeting or strategy session ever could. The city itself, in small but meaningful ways, began to rally. Tenants wrote letters of support, even started a petition, when a rumor circulated that we were selling one of our buildings. A journalist who'd grown up in one of our neighborhoods ran a story that told the truth, not about our holdings or our profits, but about the lives changed. The playgrounds rebuilt, the apartments renovated, the scholarships given to kids who once had nowhere to go after school. For every person who doubted us, a dozen more stood up and shared their gratitude. Not all attempts at sabotage were so obvious. I learned that a competitor had tried to bribe a city inspector to find code violations in one of our buildings. But our meticulous records and the relationships we'd built over years of honest work proved too solid to undermine. It was the same with our team when a disgruntled former employee tried to start a rumor about unfair labor practices. Maria and Ramon gathered everyone to speak openly, airing every concern and correcting every misconception. The truth, as always, was our best defense. There was a moment during the toughest week when I thought about stepping back, selling a building or two, making peace with the old guard just to stop the attacks. But every time I considered it, I remembered why we'd started. I remembered Mrs. Walker's gratitude after we fixed her ceiling, Joe's belief in second chances, Maria's pride in leading from the heart. Resilience, I realized, is choosing again and again to keep faith with your values, no matter how rough the storm. If there's a lesson from these days, it's this. In business and in life, your character is tested not when things go smoothly, but when they threaten to come undone. It's easy to build trust in the sunshine. It's when the clouds gather that you find out what you and your team are really made of. Our quiet empire didn't survive the onslaught because of our resources, but because of our relationships, our transparency, and our stubborn commitment to respect even under pressure. And just as things began to settle, a new and unexpected call came this time from my father. The world had changed, and perhaps so had he. He asked to meet just the two of us, far from the boardrooms and headlines. As I prepared for that conversation, I realized that sometimes the hardest battles aren't with your enemies, but with the ghosts of your past. The next chapter wouldn't just be about survival, it would be about reconciliation, understanding, and the possibility of healing what had once been broken. When my father called, his voice sounded different, lower, slower, touched with an unfamiliar humility. He didn't ask me to meet at his club or in a glass-walled office. Instead, he suggested a small diner in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where construction workers and nurses stop after their shifts, where the coffee is strong and no one notices who you are. I recognized the gesture for what it was, an invitation to meet on common ground, to speak not as rivals or business partners, but as family. I arrived early, watching him step through the door in a suit that seemed out of place among the worn vinyl booths and faded linoleum. For a moment, I saw not the imposing CEO, but just a father, uncertain and vulnerable. He hesitated before sitting down, glancing around, as if hoping not to be recognized. When our eyes met, he managed a smile, nervous but real. We talked for a long time, sipping coffee, as the diner filled with the sounds of morning. At first, the conversation was awkward. He asked about business, about the buildings, about what it was like to work side by side with people most companies never notice. I told him stories about Joe's quiet leadership, about Maria's ability to settle disputes with a smile, about how even the smallest acts of kindness can ripple through an entire community. He listened sometimes, nodding, sometimes looking away as if processing a language he'd never truly learned. Finally, he admitted something I'd never expected to hear. I used to think the only way to lead was to be the strongest voice in the room. But watching what you've built, I realize I never learned how to listen. He glanced down at his hands, weathered by age, but still restless with energy. You found a way to build something I never could, a company that cares as much for its people as for its profit. I'm proud of you, Ethan, not just for the success, but for the kind of leader you've become. It would be a lie to say all the years of pain vanished in that moment. Old wounds don't heal with a single conversation, but something softened between us. A barrier built of pride and misunderstanding began to crumble. For the first time, we spoke honestly about our fears, our failures, and the burdens we both carried. He told me about his own father, about the pressure to succeed, about the cost of always needing to be right. I saw how much of his ambition was rooted in love and how often love gets twisted by fear. He asked if I would teach him what I'd learned, not about real estate, but about building trust, about leading with humility, about seeing value where others see risk. It was a strange reversal, this old lion seeking wisdom from the son he'd once called a disappointment. But I realized then that real leadership is never about knowing everything. It's about being willing to change, to grow, and to learn from anyone, no matter their title or age. We agreed to start small. I invited him to visit one of our buildings at dawn to join Joe and me as we walked the hallways, checked the boilers, and greeted tenants as the city woke up. At first, he was awkward, unsure what to say or do. But slowly, as he listened to stories and shook hands with the crew, something in him relaxed. He laughed with Joe about a stubborn furnace, praised Maria's garden, and even lingered to chat with Mrs. Walker about her bingo nights. For a few precious hours, he wasn't a boss or a patriarch. He was just another person learning what it means to belong. One morning, after helping Joe with a minor repair, he pulled me aside. "You were right, Ethan. The heart of a building isn't in its marble floors or glass facades. It's in the people who live and work here. I wish I'd learned that sooner." He looked out over the city, the rising sun painting the rooftops in gold. "I'd like to help if you'll have me not as your boss, but as your partner, your student." The lesson in these moments was profound. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the past. It means choosing to move forward together, one honest conversation at a time. I realized that healing a family, like healing a broken building, requires patience, humility, and the willingness to see each other with new eyes. Sometimes it means starting over, not as the people we once were, but as the people we can still become. That season of reconciliation became the beginning of something new, not just for my father and me, but for the company and community we served. He didn't have all the answers, and neither did I. But together we began to imagine a future shaped less by legacy and more by love. Old habits die hard, but every day brought a chance to do better, to lead with respect, and to celebrate the victories, big and small, that come from working together. As we stood side by side, looking out over the city we both called home, I understood that the greatest inheritance isn't a fortune or a famous name. It's the courage to change, the grace to forgive, and the hope to build something that lasts. And as our story neared its next chapter, I felt ready. Whatever challenges might come, I knew I wouldn't be facing them alone. As months passed, the city seemed to move in a different rhythm. Our company continued to grow, not with fanfare, but through quiet, consistent care. Each new building was more than an acquisition. It was an opportunity to make a difference, a small promise kept to people who had long gone unnoticed. I found myself reflecting on what it meant to leave a legacy. Was it the number of properties owned, the size of your bank account, or something else entirely? I kept my old maintenance uniform hanging in my office as a daily reminder. It was a symbol not of where I'd started, but of the values I wanted to protect. Every decision, big or small, became a chance to honor that beginning, investing in affordable housing, creating scholarships for employees' children, setting up free clinics in our apartment communities. One winter, when a blizzard shut down half the city, our team worked around the clock to ensure every tenant was safe and warm. I joined them, shovel in hand, as we delivered blankets and hot meals. That night, as we gathered in the lobby sharing coffee and laughter, I felt a pride deeper than any boardroom applause. My father, now a constant presence at our weekly meetings, brought stories from his own early days. He encouraged open discussions about mistakes and celebrated the small victories: Maria's first community event, Joe's mentorship of new hires, Ramon's creative problem solving. Our company became a family of sorts, shaped not by blood but by choice. We welcomed people from every walk of life, united by a belief that respect, dignity, and opportunity should be available to all. It wasn't always perfect. There were still hard days, disagreements, setbacks, but the culture of trust and growth we'd built helped us weather every storm. One afternoon, I was invited to speak at a local high school career day. Looking into the eyes of students, some nervous, some skeptical, some quietly hopeful, I shared my story. I spoke honestly about the setbacks, the failures, the loneliness that can come from forging your own path. But I also shared the rewards, the friendships, the lessons, the sense of purpose that comes from building something bigger than yourself. I told them that success is never just about climbing higher. It's about lifting others as you go. Afterward, a young woman approached me. She said she'd always believed her background would keep her from making a difference. But now, she whispered, maybe I'll try. If there's a final lesson to this journey, it's this: true legacy isn't measured in what you own, but in what you build in. The lives touched, the doors opened. The kindness passed from one hand to another. Wealth fades, buildings age, but the impact of compassion endures. We all have the power to be stewards, not just of property or business, but of hope and opportunity for the next generation. As the sun set over the city one evening, I stood with my father on the roof of our first building. We watched as lights flickered on windows, glowing with the ordinary magic of family dinners, study sessions, quiet moments at home. He turned to me, eyes shining with gratitude. You were right, Ethan. The view from the top means nothing if you forget the people below. We stood together, two men changed by love, by hardship, by the simple courage to begin again. And so, as this chapter closes, I find myself more hopeful than ever. Our story is just one of many proof that small acts of respect, day after day, can build an empire worth inheriting. I hope you'll carry these lessons into your own life, lead with humility, value every person, and remember that every great legacy starts with a single quiet choice to care. If this story touched you, I invite you to share your own journey in the comments below. Tell us about the people who shaped you, the moments that changed you, and the ways you hope to make a difference. And if you haven't yet, don't be afraid to start building from the ground up. Thank you for listening, for believing, and for being a part of this community. Until next time, keep building, keep caring, and remember, the view from the top is sweetest when everyone can share it with you.